hopefully, hopefully our games are useful for others who really want to truly do the holistic design at the end at an industrial level. Thank you.
So I think, Nabil, you guys and all of you have developed products that have come to really high technology readiness levels, as you've shown in your videos. And you've managed to do it with all the students, postdocs, PhDs. I'm wondering is, what is, how do you come up with the final vision? Is it come at the beginning when you start talking with clinicians, you finally realize the final product and then just go toward the final goal, or at some point in during the research something happens and then you have to, for instance, incorporate different components, sensing AI. How does it for you?
I mean, often it's a mutual education process between the clinician and my group. Sometimes it's more of an education process between the students and the advisor, and vice versa. But I think as long as you don't lock yourself to a particular set of technologies just because you are stubborn, you're going to be okay. If the surgeon wants a flying toaster and he's insisting on a flying toaster for no reason, right? Then it's not going to work, right? At the same time, I can't insist on a particular type of technology just because of my own stubbornness. It has to be justified by the technical requirement at the end. And that's kind of one of the hardest aspects of doing work in our field, is because you have to kind of find something that you're excited about as a researcher and as a student, and something that is clinically meaningful for the surgeon that's working with you. Thank you.
So I think I would echo what Nabil said. Even maybe not as sarcastic or negative, but I think our plans do change as we move along during the process. So definitely there is a clinical need to do certain projects, but things do evolve. And I guess in the slides that you saw of all of our presentations, I mean, it was a long process to get there. It doesn't happen with maybe even with 1 or 2 PhD or postdocs, but it's a long process to get there. And I think, and sometimes also when you interact with clinicians, you have to find the like-minded clinicians to work with, because as Nabil said, right, I mean, if the clinician wants a flying toaster, I mean, it's not something that you can always deliver it. And also it's the interest of my interest or the researcher's interest that also have to gel together.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say you can't do holistic design at the beginning of any project because you just don't know enough about it, and neither does the physician. I mean, you've got to start somewhere, and you start from a clinical need where there's enough patients and there's enough benefit for those patients. And then you're barking up the right tree. But you can't just, boom, do holistic design in the first year. You got to understand the problem, and you do that by writing a few papers and working on it for a while. I want to push back a little bit on something Nabil said, that companies are better positioned to do this than we are. In some ways, yes, they're better positioned to make something robust. And if we're talking holistic design of like a whole system, including sterility, user interfaces, all of that kind of thing, I do think they're in a better position to do that kind of holistic design. But if we talk about holistic design in terms of really understanding the problem and really connecting the different domains of design, of sensing, of planning, of the shape your robot should take on, companies don't have the time to really delve into those things. They really have to take the first thing that works pretty well and run with it, because the longer they go, they're burning money at an incredible rate. And if they take an extra year to like deeply study some of these things, their competitors will pass them by, or they'll run out of money. And so we do have the advantage we have. Yes, it takes us a lot longer, but we can really step back and think deeply about the problem. As you saw in all of our talks. And that's the advantage we have, I think, in academia.
Interesting. And we are kind of, as Bob said, more nimble, I guess, versatile in terms of changing direction faster. Pierre, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to. And actually, we can approach this from a few different angles. So to get back to Nabil's point about oh, we're constrained by who's working on our team. I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it's important for people who are starting out as new faculty, to think about that. We never take a class in management when we're getting our PhD in engineering. And, I know with my first 1 or 2 graduate students, I assumed they would be just like me. So I assigned them an interesting problem. I sent them off. They came back at the end of the semester and they'd done nothing. And, whereas I had to do it all myself, and I assumed they would too. And so it was an iterative learning process on how to manage people. And the bottom line is, if you're working all by yourself, you have a multiplying factor of 1. If you're working with people who don't know anything, your multiplying factor goes less than 1, right? But definitively, if you have no one working for you, you're never going to get any more done than what you can do by yourself. So you have to, adjust your standards according to who's available to be on your team. And when you do that, you have to look at their strengths and their weaknesses. And yes, everyone in academia is developing. You want them to increase their skill set and get better. But you have to recognize who you're working with. And so there have been times when, I had no good experimental people on my team. And so I had to say, okay, we're going to do more algorithms and we're not going to build anything this year. And then other times, when people are great at building things, but man, don't ask them to do any math. And so, you have, those are real constraints that people have at companies, and we have them in academia too. And our goal is to just maximize our output given the resources, including human resources, that we have. And it's sort of a constant game of looking at, what the capabilities are, what the potential projects are, and matching them up. So that's the manpower issue. I don't want to talk too long. I also have some, opinions on how we tackle problems, but I'll pause in case anyone else has a comment to add at this point.
Actually, this was a great discussion. We wanted to ask these questions like at the end of this panel, but that's amazing. Like as a new faculty, what you mentioned, I just felt it like in the first year. So the manpower, how to assign the work, and we know that it's just very important. And I call it like another holistic management aspect, because we need to learn like people's strengths and try to tweak it toward the goal of the project. And so let's come back to the actually topic. So we had like seen like your great talks. I really enjoy every time I watch your talks, look at your projects. This is something new for me. I really enjoy it. And then I think with your designs where each of you are tackling a different problem. And I saw Pierre, I want to come back to you again. So in the very first of your talks, you had that nice design that I think Mohsen asked that question somehow. So you had and all of you had medical basic problem in the center, and then we had sensing, design, and control, right? So I wanted to say, let's say you have a new clinical problem in hand right now. So how do you start during the design? Do you look at the sensing and control, or you somehow answered, I guess Bob said, depends. We start from some point and then later on add to that. So how do you deal with these things? Should we have like a big picture of the overall system, or just start with something and try to add to that?
Well, where do you start actually? That's a key question.
Yeah, so
I think we probably all have our own unique approaches, and that's what makes it interesting to listen to everybody's talk and to see their perspective on it, because we do it all differently. And I think in my approach, it's one of starting a project with no assumptions, and so being willing to consider everything, no matter how crazy it is, and bouncing back and forth between the two viewpoints. And one other point I was going to make is that, as engineers, we're predisposed to working on cool technology problems, irrespective of whether or not there is any clinical need associated with them. So, there was a talk by a clinician at the Hamlin Symposium a few years ago, where he talked about problem solvers versus solution problemers. And most of us as engineers are solution problemers. We have this cool technology, and now we're going around, ringing the doorbells for all the clinicians, trying to say, hey, is this useful? And so I think in practice, we have to hold that in check, but sort of approach it from both ways. Sometimes the clinicians will come and say, oh, I've got this, here's the need. And other times you've got the technology. And so when I start out, it's sort of a bouncing back and forth of, okay, let's think about where this technology could work. No, what's the real problem here? And just trying to do sort of a dating game between all the technologies in your toolbox and all of the problems that have been brought to your attention or that you can seek out, and trying to find a good match that will then suit the capabilities of the students on your team, as well as the calls from funding agencies for what they'll fund. So it's certainly a multi-objective optimization problem.
I think I would echo what Pierre said, because your lab generally has a certain skill set of things that you know how to do, and you have students who know how to do this, and then based on the specific application that you have in mind, you use that skill set. And there might be other techniques to do this, but if you don't have it in your lab and you don't know how to use it, then I think it's not something you can do. So it's really a game of where you have to balance your resources, what you can do and what you really it's possible for you.
Yeah, I think the very best thing you can do early on is just find one doctorate that will come to your lab once a week. That's all you want. Just keep on interviewing them and keep inviting them and see which one will keep coming back to your lab once a week, at least once a week for a meeting. And then every time they do, put something new in their hands. Like show them something, hand them something, show them a cool video that maybe you didn't even do, but is out there in the field. And if you do that and they're willing to put in that time on a consistent basis, something good will emerge. I don't care what clinical specialty they're in. I don't care what tools you have in your lab. You will find something that is useful. And then you screen those things by, most importantly, the clinical significance. How many patients does it help? And how profoundly does it help them? Because if you don't have those things, you won't get grant funding for it. And then that collaboration won't ultimately end up going where you want it to go. But I think you really need to focus on finding that person who's enough bought into research and enough bought into working with you that they're just willing, because at the beginning for the physician, it's a huge time investment and they don't see the payoff for that until 3 or 4 or 5 years later. So you need one that's excited enough about it that they're willing to put in that time. They think the technology is super cool. They just want to be in your lab. I think that's the best getting started advice I could have.
I guess I definitely agree with everybody's statements, especially with Bob's opinion about having the right frequency of interaction with surgeons. Often you kind of talk to a surgeon, you go away for 3 months and you come back and say, hey, this is what I've done in the last 3 months. And then you basically risk wasting 3 months of work that are completely in the wrong direction. So having that closed loop interaction with the clinical partner would be tremendous for making sure that you're not going astray in terms of and falling in love with the Frankenstein you developed in your lab. Just be flexible and listen to your clinical partners, basically. And that's if your goal is NIH funding. If your goal is NSF funding, then the equation flips. It changes. At that point, you're asking, what's the scientific novelty of what I'm doing? And hopefully, it will have a good broad impact in terms of applications.
So to just follow up, so basically this holistic design has other components. You got to look at the source of fundings as well when it comes to designing a project.
Yeah, I think this is more of an issue, I think, in the US than in other places. I think robotics funding in the US has been limited compared to other investments around the globe.
Mm-hmm. So one other question I had, I want to ask Nabil again. You were one of the pioneers when it came to multi-backbone robots years ago. It was one of the first generations of flexible continuum robots that came. How do you see this field of dexterous surgical robots have changed, and where do you see it going in respect to other novel technologies that have come, AI, different sensing? Where do you see the field going?
I mean, I would have to give credit to people who preceded me. You know, I remember myself as a graduate student reading Ian Walker's and Greg Shirkshan's papers and, you know, Russ Taylor's works. And I would say looking at the continuum robots in general, I believe they're going to find a certain a limited set of applications where you have the necessary need for dexterous access with limited force of interaction. When you start talking about fairly large organs, then now you start reaching the limits of what you can do with a truly continuum device, which then leads you into interesting areas of how do I get collaboration between multiple of these. You can see, for example, Bob dealing with that issue with the concentric tube robots, kind of acting as a parallel mechanism, as an example, right? But I would say, with regards to the continuum robots, my interest in them is, at this point, shifting towards how do I make them more intelligent in terms of sensing their interaction along their entire length, and how do I use them as part of a telemanipulation environment. We'll have a later talk by, I believe, Russ Taylor, who will also talk about how do you use situational awareness. Part of the stuff that I did and I presented here today kind of ties into that broader theme that Russ will talk about a little bit later today. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the same question from others as well. Maybe start with Sartak. You have recently, based on your presentation, we saw implemented lots of magnetic technologies for steering and sensing of continuum robots. I just want to ask, what's your viewpoint and how did you go into direction, and where do you see these magnetically steered continuum robots going?
I think my introduction to magnetic devices actually came from when I actually was a grad student, but had the opportunity to spend some time at ETH and with Brad Nelson. So at that time, this was in more than, I guess, 15 years ago, that I saw him, and he was not working on flexible devices. He was working on micro robotic systems, and that's how that got me interested into trying to see if magnetics can be used for actuation and steering of flexible devices. And I did try to do some work on tendon-driven structures, but quickly realized that design is very important there, and they're way more capable designers than I am. So, and that's how magnetic actuation came in. And I do think that with magnetic actuation, it's possible to miniaturize structures, make them have more interesting designs with having magnetics as a way to steer things, and also you can access areas in the body with these wirelessly controlled devices, and also you can have magnetics integrated on your flexible device, both as permanent magnets, but also as with microcoils, where you have really new fabrication techniques where you can actually 3D print coils, which are at the micron level. So there's all these things that open up, I think, with using magnetics, but maybe a combination of magnetics and tendon-driven structures is a way forward. It's not something I've done, but maybe that's something to explore.
So I wanted to follow up on that, Sarthak. That was actually a nice idea. And I appreciate each of you panelists, if you can also tell, like, what do you think would be the next direction in terms of like combination, or what's the challenge that you are going to actually address with you mentioned, for instance, Nabil, you are going to focus on sensing and control, but if you could also mention, each of you, regarding the design and fabrication, what are the next limitation and challenges to address? I want to come back to Pierre. I realized Pierre is mixing soft robotics with catheter robots, and he has a new sort of robots in one of the applications. Pierre, how did you get into soft robotics and catheter? And what do you see in this regard? There is a hype of soft robotics everywhere right now. So how do you see that in addressing medical related issues?
Yeah, I have to admit, I got into that quite accidentally, Farshid. We had a grant on airway stents, and the last part of it involved, could we design stents that could be customized as they were delivered in every patient. So every patient would have one tailored to their airway. And so in that process, we were developing our own balloon catheters in the lab and delivering UV light through the balloons to cure these stents as we were positioning them. And I always had this crazy idea that I wanted to create a walking stent or something that would walk in the airways. And so, from there, we had a little extra bandwidth in one of my postdoc schedules. And so we made this, walking balloon endoscope that could be used for balloon dilations. And so it was just a matter of opportunity, looking at the resources I had, looking at, what was going on and what might be an interesting clinical need. And then again, tailoring it towards what would be most easily commercializable. So, it was just, it's standing on the corner when the bus comes by kind of thing.
I want to ask the same question from Bob as well. Where do you see this field of Dexterous continuous going, as we saw you try to commercialize two different systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's one big forward direction that I think, we have, in the research community, we kind of outstrip commercialization by a lot, right? If you think about things like Mazor, the first papers on that were right around year 2000. And then it was, finally like bought by a big company, 2 years ago or so. So it takes a while. So there's a lot of great ideas that we as a community have already come up with that aren't out there in the real world. And so I think one great direction of forward motion would be, let's get some of these systems commercialized. And so I'm working really hard on that with the concentric tube robots, and now with the notched tube robots with Endothea. So commercialization is something that is very difficult for big companies to do for a lot of reasons, because it costs them a lot of money, and they're making big bets on these systems, which can cost high-level people in the companies their job if they're wrong. So they tend to go out and acquire small companies, because then they're the hero, because they brought in the next great technology into their big company, as opposed to launching things from within. So there's a big opportunity, I think, for those among us, students coming out of labs who want to be entrepreneurial. Look around at what's out there in the world, take a good technology, and there's huge opportunity to make that real. So I would say that's one great direction, is commercialization, and there's a lot of opportunity. Another for me that I'm working on, if you look at what I'm doing in the lab at Vanderbilt, is end effector capabilities. Like, what can you actually do at the tip? And so the big one that we published first on about a year ago was suturing, intraluminal suturing. So being inside of about an 8 millimeter opening lumen, of the urethra and being able to actually throw past sutures through that thing with the little concentric tube arms and sew things back together. So that's really not easy, but there's more capabilities. I mean, you think about how are you going to cut? So actually doing electrosurgery or lasers at the tip of your robot. What's important, like we saw ablation in some of the talks. So looking with your physicians at like, how do we actually deliver energy and what do the tips of the instruments do? I think there's a lot of interesting directions there too.
So would you say, if you go back now that you've started commercialization, change anything differently, your approach, or related to the team of workshop, any parts of the system component that you realized needs improvement once you started commercialization and translation?
Yeah, the biggest one for us was the user interface. So user interfaces are always hard, and how the physician interacts with the system, you know, it's something that there's not really a mathematical equation because it deals with human cognition and what you're seeing and feeling. And so we approached it with a lot of iteration. We tried every different user interface we could possibly think of. But the key is with these systems is the first 30 seconds. When that surgeon, that new surgeon that you never worked with, who's trying to buy or thinking about buying your system, they weren't involved in the development. They have no pre-biases other than, hey, this thing might cost a lot of money to my hospital. So they have maybe a slight negative pre-bias. When they sit down, so you think about the Da Vinci, when they sit down at the Da Vinci in the first 30 seconds, they're like, oh, I know how to use these wrists. I can tie a knot. It's one of the reasons for the success of intuitive surgical. And so we worked really hard for a long time on, could we get that immersive, fun, I know how to use this thing immediately user interface. And it wasn't a straight line from point A to point B. It wasn't like, okay, we do this and then we make it a little better, a little better. It was like, no, we got to start from a bunch of different initial types of interface, optimize each one, keep putting those in surgeons' hands until you finally nail that experience, that user experience, first 30 seconds, that's what's going to sell or not sell your system.
Let me just add a point to that. You know, the questions have been focused on sort of nailing, okay, what's the future of design? What's the future of fabrication? And that's a really technology-centric question to ask. And at least from my perspective, and I think I'm speaking, you know, for the other panelists, in that you got to decide what your metrics for success are. Okay, you know, I was talking to a collaborator, and he was talking about his dealings with clinicians, and one clinician, their metric for success was having a device named after them, right? You know, and hey, everybody is entitled to that, right? But as a young professor, you may just have to get papers out, and so you may have to look at technically what's the, you know, the next solid increment I can do to this to get it published. You know, perfectly well and true. You got to do that. But at some point, if you're really interested in translation, you know, then you can take a look at what some of us have done. And Bob's a good example. You know, if you look back, he would, you know, he met with his clinicians. Then he would get a grant, an NIH grant on a particular topic, develop a prototype, and then try to spin that into a startup company. So he's, you know, the idea was there from the beginning of, okay, what's the clinical use? And then bang, he was taking it all the way through. And along that process, and I think his most recent comment, you know, about user interfaces, comment on that, you know, you can't, if you're trying to say, well, where should things go? Where should the technology go? It's always like, what is the most important technology bottleneck at that instant, okay? And so it doesn't matter where, you know, where you could do a cool algorithm paper or whatever. It's like, what's the biggest problem to solve? And then try to turn that into a cool paper. And then work on the second biggest problem. So, you know, shape sensing. I've been dabbling in shape sensing of continuum robots for years. And we do a little this and a little that, but, you know, it always turned out to be really expensive and it wasn't the biggest problem. You know, so it's still very interesting, and I may come back to it, but I haven't really, you know, that hasn't been my bottleneck. So, you know, that's sort of a framework you can use at every point in your career of, you know, what's your metric for success? What do you need to accomplish, and then focus on your approach on that.
Actually, that was my follow-up questions, that you mentioned like the bottleneck technologies that we have in terms of fabrication. So, well, I mean, that was my question. But what's the main limitation that we have here? Is it the technology limitation in terms of fabrications like 3D printing or other things like using magnets? What do you see there, Pierre? And then I want to hear others' feedback as well. So do you think in the next few years, if we improve like 3D printing or other aspects of the technologies, we can have a major shift in the field in terms of developing new ideas, or what's the limitation that you see?
It's really hard to answer that because at this point I'm doing it entirely from a clinical perspective. So I've identified, the next things that I'd like to get my preliminary results on and write a proposal about. And it's going to all involve what are the specifications for that. So if you're talking about continuum robot design, which a lot of us work in, you look at a specific clinical application and you've got to decide, what tip stiffness do I need? And Bob brought that up a little bit in his talk. What curvature do I need at the tip? And once you define those for a real problem, and the cool thing I think about working in medical robotics is, yes, there are constraints, but they're real constraints. You're not solving an imaginary problem. You're working on something that's real. And so once you define those constraints, you realize, oh, shoot, the tools aren't available. Concentric tubes aren't curvy enough. And, maybe multi-backbones are, forgive me for saying this, Nabil, but, maybe they have some other constraint that limits their use in a particular application. So you have to come up with some, hybrid thing that involves magnetics and tendons or what have you. But hopefully your motivation is going back to, each of these technologies is limited. And for me, the best academic papers were always, or theses, were the ones that started out, not in a superficial way, but went through, here's the problem we're trying to solve. And here's how each existing approach falls short. And thus, this motivated us to try X. So
if I maybe weigh in, the question was about limitations of fabrication. I would say, the overarching limitation right now is availability of resources at each one of our own labs or academic institution. Bottom line, dollar amounts available for you to build the thing that you are building, right? But realistically, if you look at materials, right? If we're using super elastic nickel titanium, right? You can now get them from manufacturers at very limited form factors, which means your design portfolio is rather limited. Processes for joining or forming these materials are kind of doable, but they're a pain to deal with. Processes for actual fabrication, you can do the things generally down to a few hundred microns internally if you have the will. It's all a matter of how much time you're willing and energy you're willing to invest in it. Things get really fuzzy when you start talking about miniature soft robots. We've done, in around 2005, we've done, the first kind of molded templates of cerebral implants from silicone. And I'm looking at the literature in soft robotics for the past 15 years, and, not much had changed since 2005. I mean, there has been, at least in terms of fabrication techniques, there's been a lot about materials and sensing, which is great, but we are still restricted in, our lives are much easier by the presence of 3D printing. But I think we're still kind of rather limited by choice of material and fabrication process, especially variability of fabrication process, which further emphasizes the need for online calibration or model rectifying approaches using sensing for these devices. Thank you.
One question from audience came up that I think is interesting related. Zhang Liang asked, for medical robotics, particularly surgical robots, and again, when we're thinking about the holistic aspect, in terms of evaluation, when it comes to evaluating your system, understand the limitations we have to come, how do you test your systems in real clinical scenarios? At what point, I want to add to this question, do you say we have to go and test it in a real ex vivo scenario? And what's the process to get there?
Yeah, I could take a first stab at that one. So, I mean, obviously you start on the benchtop. I mean, if you can't make the thing in your lab go from point A to point B on the benchtop the way you want, then you have no shot of doing it in any sort of human, right? But I think the next step is some kind of model. You want an anatomical model of some kind. And the best models that we've ever come up with in my lab, so we try not to be a model building lab, because you can just invest huge amounts of time and effort. You can make those models almost infinitely better and better and better and better and more realistic, whether you're making them out of gels or whether you're making them out of various pieces of meat or whatever it is. So we try to not invest much time because we don't want to be a modeling lab, but we want to do just enough to have a representative model that's good enough to test. And so I can give you an example. One of the coolest models we ever built in my lab was a model of a colloid cyst in the brain, which is, it's a little gel-filled bag that's literally in the ventricles. It sits in the ventricles and it plugs up the brain so the CSF can't go around where it needs to go. And so they go in and they actually have to like cut open this bag, drain all the fluid out, and then cut the bag off, wrap it up, and pull it out. That's the surgery. And some doctors are approaching that endoscopically. And so we wanted a model just to test, could our concentric tube robot actually do that procedure and help them do it better with less endoscope tilt, for example, being one of our metrics. And we built the model just by, we cast some rubber to create a ventricle shape. We segmented that off medical images. So we got the ventricle shape, we put that in some rubber so we had a void that was the right shape. And then we went to the grocery store and we got some sausage and we pulled the casing, the external shell that's around that sausage off. And we made a little bag out of that and filled it up with the gel. And the doctors loved it. I mean, they looked at it under the endoscope view and they're like, this looks exactly like what a colloid cyst looks like. It took us, one day and a trip to the grocery store. So, so my advice would be with models that you build, do all or nothing, right? If you want to be a modeling lab and you want to write papers about how to build those models, then go all in, get grants on that topic. If you don't, then try to invest minimum time, but still have a realistic model, which is often made out of different pieces of meat. Like that prostate model I showed you is glued together cow stomach and some kind of pork part, which we just tried different pieces of meat until they cut about right and they looked like a good model. Again, not a huge amount of time investment, but a very realistic phantom. So you kind of go through that phantom stage, and that's often where things even end in academia. But if you need to go farther than that, you can go to cadavers, you can go to animal models. The cadavers are actually probably less hard than you think if you've never done them before, if you're working with a physician. And they work great for some areas of the body, like the sinuses, not so great for other areas. And if you need perfusion and things, you go to various animal models. That costs more and is usually farther down the pipeline. But I mean, once you get to human, you're far, you've been working on something for 7 or 8 or 10 years by the time you ever get to a human. So it takes a while to get there.
One thing, so we're coming close to the end of session. Pierre, you mentioned you have some tips and tricks for tackling problems when it comes to new researchers starting a career to tackle a clinical problem. If you can share those and then other panelists could expand on it, that would be great.
Well, I think I mentioned most of those earlier, but it's simply a matter of identifying what you need to accomplish in the next few years. And typically for a new academic, you need to get a certain number of papers out there. And so given that you have that goal, you can look at what your most likely funding sources are and tailor your projects accordingly. So that's going to depend on what country you're in. As Nabil mentioned, in the US, there's NSF and NIH, and it's completely different approaches for getting money from either one. So, I'm happy to chat with someone on an individual basis if their funding scenario is similar to mine to give advice. The only other thing I guess that I might follow up on was Bob had mentioned, finding clinicians who are willing to come and visit you, and I'll echo that that's very important, and it's also one of looking, potentially, classifying them based at what career stage they're at. Okay, so if you get someone who's very senior, they've probably got a lot of stuff going on and have very little bandwidth for you. But if you can find someone earlier in the game who's still searching around, trying to figure out what their specialty might be, and who also has a certain desire to be research active, they might be a much better person to start with. There's a lot. I think probably Nabil and Bob benefit from being in the South, where everybody's a little bit laid back and friendly and what have you. And maybe some of you are in a similar situation, Farshid. Here in Boston, everyone's trying to kill each other to end up on top. So there's a lot of political navigation involved in talking to clinicians. Sarthak, I don't know how it is for you, but maybe you could give the European perspective.
So I think in Europe it's different than NIH or NSF. So there's funding schemes for basically to do blue sky research, which are called personal grants, which some of the participants might know about, and where there's no strings attached, and you're basically free to do the research that you want to do, and it's a fairly large sum amount of money. And within Europe and also within the European Union and also within the Netherlands, I think there's these big consortium grants, which really have an application in mind, and I think those are the ones that you really see maybe a end product or a device coming out. And in some cases, the industry leads the consortium, and in other cases, it's a university that does this. And there are generally 4 to 7, 8 partners. There are several, 5 to 10 million euro projects. So in the end of 4 years or 3 years, you generally get something out of it. So the funding scheme is different, there's competition everywhere, north, south, east, west, right? So you compete for the same pot of money. So
Sarthak, how do you get on those teams? That's where you said maybe the politics gets where it comes in, right? So it's who you know, kind of, and you coordinate it yourself, and then you invite people, or you get invited into these things. So that's how it happens. So there's certain rules within how many European countries can be there. So you have to get invited, so people must know who you are, or you start something and invite people. And there are specific calls. So it's just like NIH or NSF has specific calls. You have this, but there's less on showing preliminary data. I think that's something that maybe is a bit different than how the NIH funding scheme works. So that's, I think, the big difference. But there is in the national level, there are NIH kind of things where you really have to show preliminary data, otherwise you don't get it. But then they're generally run by clinicians, so not by biomedical engineers.
So I guess, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Navid. No, Navid.
Yeah, so I'll just end quickly with my advice for a tenure track faculty professor is, if you're not having fun, I guess try to balance your personal need of having fun while doing the work, because that's when you're going to be most productive, with the looming expectation of, oh, I need a certain number of papers to get tenure, right? So if you can get to that sweet spot where you can minimize the number of papers while maximizing the contribution and having the most fun, that's that's a recipe for success, irrespective of whether you get tenure or not, right? Because if you haven't had tenure and that you've just wasted 6 years of your life, and you're going to be depressed eternally about it, right? Just be true to yourself, do what you want to do, and everything else should fall in place if you're careful about it. Thank you.
There is a question actually in the chat, and then I wanted to ask this question, like about modeling and like these machine learning algorithms that we have analytical modeling and there is a like data-driven and machine learning approach. Do you see, I mean, any basically use of this machine learning or data-driven on the design and fabrication, or we can just follow the analytical approach? And one more follow-up questions, this mixing these two is, what are the challenges in terms of modeling that we are facing right now? What are the research direction that still needs to be basically addressed?
Yeah, so I mean, I can address that certainly in the context of like the curved tendon robots that I was talking about, which I think is the question the chat was dealing when I said we could, how do we invert these models? And then the snare robots where you're making the parallel robots inside the body. I mean, both of those two systems, like we have a forward model, right? So if you tell me the number of tendons and you tell me their paths and you tell me where they're tied off and you tell me how hard you're pulling on each one of them, I can tell you what the robot shape is. But going the other way and saying I have an anatomical cavity that's shaped like this, and then there's this path that I would like my robot to, as it enters, I would like it to follow this curve. I can't tell you how many tendons you need and where you got to tie them off. And there's an infinite number of possibilities, right? Because every one of those tendons can have a different curve through space, right? And there's so literally many, many infinite possibilities there. So I think that's a good opportunity for some kind of smart algorithm. So machine learning is one candidate, and there's probably lots of other smart algorithms that computer scientists can come up and help us mechanical designers with. And then we can actually, as mechanical design people, we can actually make prototypes that actually do what those computer algorithms say. So for me, it's been really productive in my career. I teamed up with a great computer scientist, Ron Alterovitz, and you guys know that we've had many grants together. And so we're solving two sides of the coin. So, you know, I'm telling him like what's roughly possible. He's designing something, I'm trying to build it. He's telling me what would be optimal. If, you know, if you could do it this other way, maybe it would be better. So there's a give and take there. And I think it's really hard for one person to be an expert on all of those things. So I think it's one example of where you want to really collaborate. So, and I think there's a lot of space to play when you talk about inverting, because all the robots you heard today, they pretty much all have forward models. And a lot of times there's not a straightforward way unless you make a lot of assumptions to do a design problem, inverting that. So.
Nabil, what do you think? I mean, all of you, if you can answer the same question, would be great.
Yeah, so I guess for me, I try to go as far as I can with a model to the extent where that I reach a point of diminishing returns. There isn't a point of having a very, very accurate model if you have a closed loop control algorithm. Otherwise, just dispose of the control and do open loop, right? But there is definitely a place for machine learning methods for characterizing model uncertainties. You know, we have wide range of uncertainty and transmission losses in these mechanisms. I've certainly have realized that probably one of the more powerful ways of dealing with this is, you know, sparse regression methods, which we've been using. So there certainly is a place for these wherever you can see that there's a tangible improvement. But I would caution against trying to throw everything that you know and just going blindly with the black box model at it. If you do that, then you have a black box that works in a particular scenario and you have a paper out of it, and then other people will have multiple papers improving over your crappy paper and citing it, increasing your citation index, but that's not a path that we should go as academicians. Thank you.
Sarthak, what do you think for your robots, specifically magnetic actuated robots?
So I think, yeah, I mean, so in my line of work, I think we build models not for the sake of building a model, for basically to try to control it. So I think if the model is as simple as possible, then it would probably work in real time, and you would be able to do all the fancy control on top of it to actually to improve its accuracy. So I think what we've observed that with well-established modeling methods, it has been possible to achieve reliable control. And I think that's where sensing and imaging really have come in, where I think the ability to track your device when it's deep inside the body, or when there are occlusions, using other sensing modalities, not just shape sensors, but there are other ways to do this, is I think where I think we have benefited. And I think in terms of, there are still open questions on how to model flexible devices with as they interact with the environment. And I think that's still an active topic, but I think accurately controlling it is at least my main priority at this point.
Pierre, what's your response to the same question?
Sure. So I think there are a couple aspects of this. So first off, in the device control, when we're using, we're typically using hysteretic materials in these designs. And so, I don't know of any great models out there that include hysteresis for a distributed system. So certainly there's room for improvement in kinematic dynamic control of these systems. And then at least for some of the applications I'm looking at in medical interventions where you're trying to modify the environment, just as you can think of the robot as an elastic deformable structure, so is the tissue. And so, sort of a long-term ultimate goal is to be able to provide assistance to the clinician, advising them how to deform the tissue in order to produce the best clinical outcome. Okay, so it's a design problem where you're coupling, what should the structure be of the robot, what should the model be of the robot, with how should you modify your environment with the robot to optimize your repair. And the beautiful thing about robots where you've got integrated imaging is you can record these data sets. And if you know the outcome of a procedure and you forgot to record a data set for it, then hopefully you can build up sufficient training data to actually get something meaningful out of it in terms of producing an assistant system for the clinician. So that's sort of a long-term goal that I have.
Amazing. Mohsen, if you don't mind, we ask audience to come and ask a couple of questions if there is any. We are at the end of almost this panel.
Yeah, if anybody has any general questions.
Raise your hand, please, and then go ahead. So there was one more actually in the chat. I don't know if we did cover it or not, from Mohammed. Actually, Mohammed, go ahead. You have raised your hand.
Hi, thank you very much for organizing such a great workshop. So my question goes for Professor Dupont. Thank you for your inspiring talk. Is it feasible to utilize your UV molded airware stent technique for aggressive types of interventions where we want to selectively keep the stent in place or collapse it quickly in a harsh environment when required? Thank you.
I need to know more about what you're trying to do.
For example, for kidney nephroliphotomy application, where you want to use that balloon structure to keep the path, urinary path open to access to kidney. Can we use that sort of balloon technique you have?
I see. Well, and I'm happy to continue chatting with you, by email or whatever offline from this. In short, I would not use the UV curing method because that's sort of a permanent method. If you want to create a customized, permanent or semi-permanent implant, that's when you use the UV curing technique. But it certainly would be possible to inflate and deflate balloons rapidly to produce varying constraints within the body, which I think is what you're alluding to. Thanks for an interesting question.
Thank you so much.
Amir, go ahead. You have a question.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the nice presentation. I have a question regarding the resultant stiffness of the robot when it's working with the environment. Because as far as I know, when we have a flexible robot and when it comes to a flexible environment like a tissue, they will work as a series type of spring. But my question is that the stiffness of the robot in Cartesian is a matrix, and also the stiffness of the environment is also a matrix. How we can come to a resultant matrix for the resultant stiffness matrix for the robot and the environment?
So I guess I'll take this one. If you take the strong assumption that you have the somehow an approximation of the environmental stiffness, and you can take two approaches for this. One is looking at kind of meshless approaches for modeling soft tissues. You can look at some of the works of Sovrano Day from RPI. Those can possibly give you an interactive rate update of a prediction, assuming, again, an additional strong assumption that you have the geometry and you have the knowledge of the heterogeneous tissue properties. So you can see how I'm building the assumptions there, right? But assuming you have all of that, now you've made contact with your robot, you know the robot local stiffness, which again is a somewhat strong assumption because we have a linearized model for stiffness. We don't have a generalized model for large deflection stiffness unless you're willing to invest a ton of time in dedicated code for a particular architecture, right? Once you've connected all of these, then you know the literature for a resultant system with a two springs connected in series is available in general, right? But my advice would be not to try to do this, but then use your robot itself as an exploratory device to locally estimate the environment stiffness. That is something that we tried doing about maybe more than 10 years ago with Roger Goldman, which seemed to work at a small scale deformations. If you're doing larger scale deformations, then I would suggest you look at some of the works by INRIA. They have a French group focused on modeling of soft robots. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? We are almost at the end of this panel.
Before we close down, I'd like to ask the panelists if they have any remarks.
Well, thank you for organizing this.
We are trying this new way to handle a workshop. I would like to ask you your opinion as well. Would you prefer the traditional presentation style or more of a discussion type of workshop as we have it right now? Which format would you suggest?
Well, if you're asking us, I think you're asking the wrong group. I mean, I think we've all had a lot of fun, but I think you need to ask everybody else on the Zoom meeting whether or not they've had as much fun as we have. And as Nabil pointed out, having fun is an important part of the equation.
So just to add, we have a poll on the website for this workshop. We would like to ask all the audience to please fill out the forms, give us your feedback on generally the workshop and some of the topics discussed here. We'd love to have your feedback.
I wanted to add to that. So we are going to collect this data. These are some questions, perspective questions. After the workshop, hopefully you are going to write a review sort of paper on the same topic. That would be great. And then we want to collect all the data from the audience, from the panelists, and see where we are standing. I think thanks to the Zoom and this technology that we have, instead of just unidirectional just talk, we wanted to make it more interactive. That's the reason Mohsen asked, how do you feel as a panelist? Obviously, audience also have some comments. What do you think? I mean, that's very useful for us. And the plan is that we want to have the second workshop, the same topic, and then number 2 and 3, hopefully suggested later on. If you, I mean, we would love to get your feedback, what you realize on this format.
Well, I mean, as a panelist, we like talking with each other, so it's been a lot of fun, you know, talking with Pierre and Emil and Star Talk. So from our perspective, I mean, this having more time for discussion like this is great. But again, like Pierre said, it's really what did the audience get out of it?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to continue with the next series of video presentations. You can join the breakout room. We have 4 other great presentations there. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.